Amazing. So welcome to We Are Like Eggs Against Stone, Atmospheres and Terrains of Power in the Malagasy Central Highlands. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. My name is Gabrielle, a PhD candidate in anthropology and STS at MIT. And so the title of this talk is drawn from a Malagasy proverb, Niatud simiad an, which is eggs can't fight against stone. And two people who occupy two very different positions in medical industries in Madagascar's Central Highlands used versions of this proverb to articulate a shared sense of fragile powerlessness against insurmountable obduracy, which I want to use in this talk to think through how overlapping forms of unfreedom and power operate on the island in the pandemic era. So the first is Rasua, who is a washerwoman of free descent who lives adjacent to a factory for pharmaceutical ingredients near the major central highland city of Firnarantsu in Madagascar's south center. I call this factory Viver, which is green life in French. And Rasua described the sort of toxic smells and smoke that emit from this factory, which operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Viver promised the surrounding neighborhood jobs and other benefits, including school programs and support for the neighborhood's unemployed youth, but the residents have seen none of these. They have only choked on the company's putrid emissions. But we can't complain, Rasua said. We are tuud miat anambat, eggs powerless against the stone of the company. The second instance of this was from Mami, a countryside farmer of likely slave descent who lives 35 kilometers south of Firnarantsu in a village called Anduharana. He grows medicinal crops for Viver on relatively poor quality land. And one day, very drunk, he lamented the difficulties of life to me as he struggles to make a living given the company's extremely low crop prices and his exclusion from village networks. Sort of unable to profit from his meager land and marginal to both corporate and village centers of power, he articulated the sense of being caught under the weight of crushing impossibility, an egg against stone. So I want to consider how Rasua and Mami's shared articulations of impotence help us put together present and past layers of control or power in Madagascar. My basic argument is that we need to think about forms of unfreedom or powerlessness as always multiple in contexts where contemporary corporate dominance under a permissive state expands alongside ongoing legacies of bondage to build scholarly approaches to domination that can move flexibly across overlapping systems of power. And given this conference's engagement with environment as material for both forms of unfreedom and liberation, I especially want to think about how air and land mediate these negotiations of power in the Central Highlands with these two cases of eggs against stone. So first, I'll tell you a little bit more about my work on medical industries in Firnarantsu region. Why are there pharmaceutical factories making drugs? Why are people growing medicinal crops? And then I'll go through in more detail how eggs against stone manifest in these urban and countryside contexts and suggest some major takeaways about how class and freedom operate through air and land here. My wider goal is to think through how primarily ethnographic or STS approaches to contemporary industries can enfold more historical perspectives on sedimented inequalities. So I'm an anthropologist of science and medicine. My dissertation research deals with the long backstory and complicated social, environmental, religious, and technological dynamics behind Madagascar's commercialization of a #Made in Madagascar drug for COVID-19 called COVID Organics. Here you see the president, Andry Rajoelina, advertising the original drinkable form that was commercialized early in 2020. And then there is a sort of improved pill form made later in 2020 as well, called CVO+. Rajoelina started a nationalized pharmaceutical factory in the island's capital called Pharmalagas to distribute these medicines and other necessary generics. And the drug sparked international controversy during the pandemic, as well as popular backlash. But here, the important thing to take away is that CVO ingredients are processed at Viver's factory in Fionneret-Sioux that pollutes Rasua's air before those ingredients are sent onward to Fort Malagasy in the capital. So these pharmaceutical ingredients are derived from the Artemisia annua plant, which you can see here, which is an herb with potent antiviral properties, first used in China, but now extant in Madagascar for many years. Viver contracts with farmers like Mami in agrarian areas around the city to grow this crop for their drug ingredients. And this type of contract farming for medicinal compounds has been a livelihood strategy in the region since 2005, when Viver began operations. So 2005 is obviously much earlier than 2020, when Artemisia came on the scene for COVID-19 drugs. Before the pandemic, Viver was mainly using the plant to process pharmaceutical ingredients for anti-malarial medicines, which would then be exported to major multinational companies like Merck for further processing into finished anti-malarial drugs. So before the pandemic, you had this kind of global anti-malarial industry that was powered by Malagasy farmers growing Artemisia on contract, who still largely lacked access to the finished pharmaceutical product, even while malaria cases increased in the highlands. During and after the pandemic, you had this swerve to a sort of explicitly nationalist framing, where the state was going to capitalize on medical resources that would otherwise have been sent abroad to make this, hashtag made in Madagascar drug. So beyond this instance of global medical inequality, Viver's contract farming and drug processing are also happening in the Central Highlands, which is a context also stratified by legacies of internal bondage. So as Anders, Gwynn's, and Kelly's talks yesterday have made clear, slave taking and slave trading were widely practiced in Madagascar before French colonization. And these histories of enslavement sort of ramify out today, as descent from the formerly enslaved is still a source of social marginalization, where slave descendants are stigmatized as unclean or impure and subject to various forms of control for their behavior. And this is a major theme in social studies of the region. So given this, one of my major research questions is how pandemic and pre-pandemic medicine in Madagascar is situated in these multiple overlapping networks of power. How do Highlanders navigate systems of medical production that are simultaneously rooted in the inequalities of 21st century global pharmaceutical industries, in Highland experiences as successive waves of imperialism by the Marina and the French, in the sort of neo-colonial corporate expansion that enfolds kind of public-private corruption, and then finally also in forms of social differentiation and hierarchization specific to Highland histories of bondage. So in other words, Fort Malagasy, the Antananarivo pharmaceutical factory, its slogan is to change history with science. And I'm asking sort of what histories do these made in Madagascar medicines address? Oh my God, hold on. Sorry, guys. All right, and so to answer that question, I've pursued sort of extensive combined research, combined remote and in-person ethnographic fieldwork in Fionneret-Sioux here, as well as archival research in both Madagascar and France. So this fieldwork was multi-sited. It was split between Mami's village, Anduharena here, which is 15 kilometers north of Ambalavao down there, as well as time spent in Fionneret-Sioux here, and in a village I call Antanikarena here, which is one of the first cultivation hubs for Viver that began Artemisia growing in 2005. So in this talk, I focus mainly on Anduharena and Fionneret-Sioux, and I picked Anduharena specifically because residents there pursue Artemisia cultivation alongside these controls between farmers of slave descent and farmers of free descent. So this multi-sided work has enabled this view of medical industry's social impact through kind of multiple striations of social difference, including urban versus rural, free versus unfree, Betsileo versus non-Betsileo, and Malagasy versus foreigner. And air and land are sort of crucial vectors for these negotiations of power. So first about air. Rasua's sense of being an egg against stone was rooted in Viver's ongoing pollution of her neighborhood adjacent to the factory, especially the factory's sort of constant outpouring of this smoke. So the smells associated with Viver were major sources of complaint for both residents nearby the factory and for Artemisia farmers. About the factory, residents complained about the smell even several kilometers away. Many attributed neighborhood cases of respiratory illness or other frequent sicknesses to their sort of constant exposure to these factory emissions. And Rasua and other neighborhood residents kind of decried this bodily suffering that they experienced as a result of the factory's sort of atmospheric manifestations. So if we think about this sort of visceral image of an egg breaking open when it's thrown against a rock, here you sort of, the residents' exposure to Viver smoke sort of breaks the body open too, as they have no ability to prevent harmful absorptions of the smoke that leads to asthma, coughs, and other respiratory issues. Meanwhile, farmers also regularly told me about how much they hated the smell of Artemisia itself. The plant smell is extremely strong, like an antiseptic mint, and it clings to your clothes and to your skin during and after work with the crop. And farmers would kind of consistently tell me that this powerful smell sort of empties the belly and makes you hungry as you breathe it in. And in sort of participant observation with farmers, we would actually eat much more than usual after Artemisia work to offset the crop's effects on farmers' bodies. And for farmers like Mommy, who already struggle to provide for themselves, the crop's added burden of this visceral hunger amplified a sense of bodily suffering for Viver's material gain. And for some farmers, this hunger was enough for them to abandon contractual relationships with Viver in favor of other crop contracts, for example, barley for Star, which is the manufacturer of Three Horses beer. But so like neighborhood residents' bodies like break open given Viver smoke, farmers' bodies did as well, as the plant's strong smell sort of inescapably suffused the countryside air. And given these embodied experiences of Viver's sort of atmospheric contaminations in a way, Highlanders here sort of really decried these pandemic medical industries spearheaded by the government as a form of, as one friend put it, colonialism by the state. You know, the Jean de Dieu, this friend in Andujarena, narrated this sense of state encroachment when he described how Artemisia fields have expanded consistently through the region. What was a workforce of something like 10,000 farmers before the pandemic has now almost doubled to closer to 20,000. And as Artemisia takes up more and more land, this disagreeable smell is more and more prevalent. It yields more and more hunger for Highlanders across social classes. And people really saw this sort of inescapable enmeshment as a kind of vaporous manifestation of government authority. The Malagasy state's interests were atomized and diffused. They suffused highland landscapes in a way that both farmers and factory residents saw as deeply objectionable, but also fundamentally inescapable. So air here is this sort of potent vector that transmits suffering to both farmers and neighborhood residents through the sort of obligate breath. And the inescapability of scent cemented this broader sense of futility as corporate dominance and state dominance kind of dissolved into each other. And I bring this up here partly because scholarly assessments of CVO so far have dismissed it as a simple illustration of state failure to deal with the pandemic. But for my interlocutors in the Highlands, this isn't an example of state weakness, but is instantiation of state overreach. You know, Rasua and her neighbors and Artemisia farmers are caught in these inhabited landscapes that are inescapably atmospherically changed by government embrace of a medicinal crop cultivation and processing. And this is a government overreach that's visceral and sensory. So understandings of Malagasy pandemic response should sort of take much more seriously these atmospheric and bodily manifestations of state and corporate power, rather than sort of dismiss CVO out of hand. All right, so I want to move from air to land and fertility in another sense. So mommy's difficulties in Andujarana. And here I'll introduce some of the social complexities around the village and think especially about land as a vector for enduring social hierarchies that ended up amplifying this state and corporate power in this medical industry. So there's actually two Anduharanas. One is a hilltop site that's the ancestral home of Betsileo upper social classes. And the other Anduharana is slightly smaller to the south and west of Anduharana 1, where a group of people called Huvavau live, or the new Huva, including Mami, who are imputed to be of unclean or slave descent. And I should note that while most of the scholarship on slave descendants in Madagascar use the word Andevu, I've pretty much never heard that ever in my fieldwork. Huvavau was the word that anyone would use. And in some sources, Huvavau can refer to someone formerly enslaved who was freed and manumitted. Scholars of social hierarchy in the highlands tend to sort of use Huvavau as a simple synonym or euphemism for Andevu, but I've been wondering sort of more and more what taking Huvavau seriously as its own analytical category could mean. Does it signify slightly more than a simple euphemism, for example? But relationships with residents of Andujarana 1 and 2 did seem to ally with imputation of slave descent status to the second group. There were strict behavioral codes that governed interactions between the residents of the two Anduharanas. Residents of one couldn't marry residents of the other. Residents of Andujarana 1 were prohibited from working the fields for residents of Andujarana 2, and various purifying rituals were required if the sort of upper class residents did come into too much contact with the people, dirt, or mud of Andujarana 2. People generally affirmed that everyone got along and there was no real difference between them at the Huvavau, but this was troubled in practice by these kinds of concerns about uncleanness, as well as differences in resource access, especially land quality. So Andujarana 1's land was generally more extensive, fertile, and easily accessible than fields for Andujarana 2 residents. And this tracks with other scholarship in the region, which attests to how upper class control of land availability and their relative unwillingness to cede good land to Huvavau people. And in this work, people of slave descent's relegation to inferior land generally builds arguments for their ongoing marginalization. But this isn't necessarily entirely the whole story. So Coulard, writing in the 70s on Huvavau and Zafi-Maniri regions further east, tells us that due to Huvavau dependence on sub-quality land, they adapted new cultivation techniques or crops to manage their livelihoods. So according to Coulard, Zafi-Maniri Huvavau were richer and more skilled farmers than free descendants due to this adaptability to difficult land conditions. And it was Huvavau who broke taboos against rice cultivation in the area, who grew the first rice supplies, practices of sort of agricultural creativity that people of free descent eventually also took up, even as they still held Huvavau at arm's length.
Gabrielle, yeah. So sorry to interrupt, but we have about like 6-7 minutes, okay?
Yeah, you're good. I'm almost done. Okay. Thank you. So from Coulard's work, I read a suggestion to pay attention to pay attention to how Huvavau land access leads to these forms of agricultural novelty and change. And we can actually see elements of this in Andujarana 1 and 2's involvement in Artemisia cultivation. It was the Huvavau from Andujarana 2 who undertook the first Artemisia contracts with Viver in the mid-2000s, not residents of Andujarana 1. The company sort of actively promoted the crop as a means to improve land quality. Artemisia helps fix necessary nutrients in soil and reduces pest burden. It's also very input light, so you don't need a lot of water or very much fertilizer, even though the company does regularly distribute fertilizer supplies for contracted growers. And company technicians also regularly hold trainings on how to mix composts, how to plant cover crops to ensure ongoing nutrient availability and soil quality. So by signing up to grow Artemisia, Huvavau of Anduharena II could access a crop that promised to improve their substandard land, as well as supplies of fertilizers and composts that they could also divert to other crops, which many people did. Anduharena residents, or Anduharena I residents, really only took up contracts several growing cycles after the first harvests by the Huvavau, and Huvavau are more likely to cultivate now than in Anduharena I. So here we kind of see how the expansion of medical industries through the highlands was in part enabled by these longer legacies of social differentiation that dictated access to quality land. Huvavau's dependence on poor land made them prime candidates for vivair contracts, and expansion of state corporate power relied on these earlier and literally sedimented instantiations of ancestry-based hierarchy. And I should mention here that land quality is an existential concern on the island, especially given impacts of climate change. So there's sort of extensive concern to protect soil nutrients and stop erosion. But like Rasua and others nearby the factory subject to polluted air, Huvavau Artemisia farmers increasingly saw the company's contracts as mechanisms of sort of cyclical impotence, even as they hoped for future land improvements. So the company's prices, for example, for dried Artemisia leaves haven't kept even with pandemic inflation. So farmers like Mami are effectively making less now than they had been previously. And so he felt caught in this contract, sort of like seduced by the idea of improving his land quality for future yields. Even as he struggled to make ends meet in the present, he told me that he hoped Artemisia could monetize tan to improve his land, which would allow him to plan for a long-term future. So Mami's commitment to land's possibilities endured even as in his present, like Rasua's, he was marked by sort of Artemisia's banal impossibilities. In our conversations, there was still this sort of sense of hope that one day, after enough Artemisia harvests, Mami wouldn't be an egg against stone anymore. That's all I have for now. Thank you very much.